welcome to everyone. In particular, I'm honored to welcome Professor Susan Wolf to their second session in this series, Pufendorf Lectures. And the topic of today's lecture is blame and criticism.
Right.
Yeah, criticizing blame.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
Well, let me get this up. So thank you all for coming, for many of you for coming back. As I said yesterday, thank you also, the university, the department, everyone, for inviting me to give these lectures. It's a great honor to be here, and I am really enjoying myself. As I explained yesterday, I prepared these lectures on the assumption that there would be some members of the audience who go to one and not the others, so I wrote them in a way that I hope are capable of being understood independently, even though they all aim in the direction of a single set of ideas. Yesterday, I reflected on the ways many people respond to art and to artists on the basis of their art, using these reflections as a way to suggest, among other things, that our concept of responsibility is wider and messier than most philosophical accounts recognize it to be. Today, I'll be arguing for the same view, but coming at it from a completely different angle, in the hopes that by doing so, some different people will be convinced, but in any case, different features of the view will come into focus, fleshing it out in more detail. Unlike yesterday's lecture, which tended to dwell on cases of positive evaluation and affectionate response, today's lecture, as its title and picture announces, is more occupied with negative responses in the neighborhood of blame. Also, unlike yesterday's lecture, this one has nothing to do with art. For those who attended yesterday's lecture, I should apologize in advance for a certain amount of overlap and repetition. For those who didn't attend yesterday's lecture, I should apologize in advance for the much less amusing and interesting PowerPoint slides to which you will be subjected. It's all words today, basically. I begin, as I did yesterday, by noting a standard contrast between two kinds of responsibility, which philosophers often use to open their discussion of the subject. There is, on the one hand, a purely causal use of responsibility. X is responsible for Y in this sense, picks out X as the cause, or at any rate as a salient cause of Y. Anything that can be a cause can therefore stand in the place of X, a person, an animal, a piece of machinery, a religious belief, a weather phenomenon. On the other hand, there is what is typically described as a moral use of the term. X is responsible for Y in the moral sense, asserts a tighter or deeper connection between X and Y, of a kind that would make blaming X appropriate if the Y in question is bad, and praising or crediting X appropriate if the Y is good. The kind of being that can occupy the X place in the moral sense may be called a morally responsible agent. It's generally agreed that inanimate objects, lower animals, and very young children, not to mention ideas and weather phenomena, can be causally responsible but not morally responsible. If there are any morally responsible agents at all, people think, the best candidates are adult human beings of average or better than average intelligence and mental health. To reinforce our sense of the contrast, consider a state of affairs, let it be an undesirable state of affairs, that could have any of a variety of possible causes. Yesterday it was a clump of dead trees. Today it's a stain on the carpet. The stain on the carpet could be the result of a pipes bursting, a baby spitting up, a cat knocking over the milk, or a roommate carelessly spilling coffee on her way to her desk. In the causal sense, it could be a pipe or a baby, a cat or a roommate that is responsible for the mark. But it's only the last, it seems natural to say, that it would be appropriate to blame for the spot, for only the roommate is or could be morally responsible for the stain. Still, sticklers for language, as philosophers tend to be, might point out that my characterization of that contrast is too rough. For just as there's a broader and a narrower sense of responsibility, there's a broader and narrower sense of blame. It would not be unusual for someone to blame the weather for spoiling her picnic or the carburetor for making the car stall. Similarly, it wouldn't be weird or confusing for someone to blame the stain on the carpet on the cat, even though, in a stronger or deeper sense, only the roommate would be an appropriate object of blame. And indeed, these two senses of blame seem exactly parallel to the two senses of responsibility. When we blame an event on a cat or a carburetor, we mean only to say that the individual is causally responsible for the event, under the condition implied by our choice of the word blame that we judge the event in question to be undesirable or bad. And of course, we can use this same causal sense when we blame an event on a person. But when someone is morally responsible for an event that is bad or wrong, a different kind of blame may be in order, which we might refer to as moral blame. For the remainder of this talk, I shall use blame and responsibility to refer to the narrower, stronger, or moral sense of these terms. It's the concepts to which these stronger senses refer that have been and continue to be the subject of so much philosophical puzzlement and debate. But I opened my discussion with the contrast between the broader and narrower uses of the terms, not only to clear the ground, but also to bring out what I take to be a pervasive assumption in discussions of responsibility and blame, namely that there is a dichotomy, or at any rate a single unitary contrast in the background between responsible and non-responsible beings, between those individuals who can be appropriate objects of blame and those who cannot. For much of the philosophical topic's history, the contrast was characterized in terms of whether individuals who were causally responsible for things were appropriately or justifiably deserving of punishment, reward, condemnation, and approval. But in the 1960s, the philosopher P.F. Strawson significantly enlarged and enriched the discussion by emphasizing the attitudes beside and beneath these responses that often animate our interest in a deeper way. As Strawson noted, the practices or attitudes just mentioned of punishment, reward, condemnation, and approval permit, where they do not imply, a certain detachment from the actions or agents which are their objects. Strawson turned our focus instead toward the non-detached attitudes and reactions of people directly involved in transactions with each other. He wrote of the attitudes and reactions of offended parties and beneficiaries, of such things as gratitude, resentment, forgiveness, love, and hurt feelings. These attitudes of involvement or participation in human relationships, attitudes Strawson termed reactive attitudes, he contrasts with what he calls the objective attitude or range of attitudes, which he characterizes as follows. And again, this is the repetition. To adopt the objective attitude to another human being is to see him perhaps as an object of social policy, as a subject for what, in a wide range of sense, might be called treatment, as something certainly to be taken account, perhaps precautionary account of, to be managed or handled or cured or trained, perhaps simply to be avoided. The objective attitude may be emotionally toned in many ways, but not in all ways. It may include repulsion or fear. It may include pity or even love, though not all kinds of love. It cannot include the range of reactive feelings and attitudes which belong to involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships. It cannot include resentment, gratitude, forgiveness, anger, or the sort of love which two adults can sometimes be said to feel reciprocally for each other. If your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then though you may fight with him, you cannot quarrel with him. And though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. You can at most pretend to quarrel or to reason with him. Part of Strawson's point is to remind us how central it is to our form of life that we engage with each other reactively, to point out how much colder and bleaker our lives would be if we took only the objective attitude or range of attitudes towards ourselves and each other instead. Another part is to make the connection between our proneness to see ourselves and each other as subjects and objects of the reactive attitudes on the one hand, with the concepts of responsibility and blame on the other. Indeed, to many philosophers, including myself, it has seemed reasonable to identify being a responsible agent with being an appropriate object of reactive attitudes, and to identify blameworthiness more specifically with being an appropriate object of the negative reactive attitudes of resentment, indignation, anger, and the like. Strawson's essay, while it deepens our understanding of responsibility and blame, accepts the idea that there is a single contrast in the background between two types of agent, the responsible and the non-responsible. Two types of relation an agent may bear towards her actions and their consequences, and two types of attitude, reactive attitudes and objective attitudes, that it may be respectively appropriate to have. Strawson recognizes that the categories that the categories that he contrasts do not admit of sharp boundaries. There is, as he notes, a continuum stretching between individuals such as inanimate objects and infants at the one end, and mature, mentally healthy adult human beings at the other. Still, his writing suggests that there are two clusters of ideas and a contrast between them, even if there is a continuum running from one pole of the contrast to the other. If an individual is responsible, it can be appropriate to punish and reward, to blame and credit, to hold reactive attitudes towards her. And if an individual is not responsible, then none of these reactions are justified. Although there is enormous controversy about how to understand the concepts on the left side of the contrast, on whether these concepts properly apply to anyone, and if so, when and to whom, it's generally assumed that the concepts over which such controversies are discussed are themselves single, unified concepts that all parties to the discussion are trying to analyze and understand. To ask what responsibility is, what blame is, what the category of reactive attitudes is to assume that the term or phrase in each case refers to some single feature, phenomenon, or category, if it refers to anything at all. My aim today is to question this assumption, and to do so by focusing on the reactive attitudes, and more specifically on the negative reactive attitudes that are commonly regarded as forms of blame. I shall be arguing that there are at least two sets of negative attitudes that we sometimes have towards individuals, both of which are to be contrasted with objective attitudes, but which have different conditions of appropriateness. We're used to thinking that if an individual is responsible, it may be appropriate to punish and reward, to blame and credit, and to hold reactive attitudes towards her, and that if an individual is not responsible, then none of these reactions are justified. But if the reactive attitudes do not constitute a unified category with a unified set of conditions, then it becomes unclear what we so much as mean by blame and credit, what we mean by the idea of responsible agency, and how these concepts relate to the appropriateness of punishment and reward. So let us turn our attention to blame and to the attitudes that are thought to constitute forms of blame. What is it to blame someone? We may begin by considering some paradigm cases. A woman is late picking up her friend to go to the movies, causing them to miss the previews and even the opening scene. The friend is annoyed and thinks the driver should apologize. This case is trivial, but there are equally clear cases at the more serious end of the spectrum of importance. a man discovers that his nephew is poisoning his father, wanting to kill him and secure his inheritance. The man is furious and indignant and wants the nephew to be severely punished. In both cases, two central elements in the blamer's perception of the situation combine to lead to a judgment of blame. First, an individual does something wrong or harmful. That is, second, due to a fault in the individual's character. Together, these lead the blamer, first, to form a negative attitude, annoyance in the one case, anger in the other, and a desire or demand for some sort of sanction. In the first case, that the friend apologize. In the second, perhaps jail time. But these two elements might also occur independently. And an individual might do something wrong or bad, though no fault in the individual is involved, or an individual might possess a fault that yet fails to issue in a wrong or bad act. In such cases, is it still possible or warranted to blame? One might think that the answer in the first case is easy. If the action doesn't arise from an individual's fault, blaming the individual anyway would be wrong or mistaken. In fact, I believe that the issue is more complicated, but I shall not have time to pursue this today. Instead, let's turn to the other side of the question. If a person has a fault but does nothing wrong, or at any rate, nothing one knows about that is wrong or harmful to oneself or to people one cares about, might one justifiably blame the person anyway? Imagine, for example, that a woman knows that her friend is the sort of person who is always late. She shows up at her classes at the very last minute. She's the last to arrive at a party. And so, preemptively, the woman always volunteers to do the driving herself when they go to the movies together. Or consider the nephew. He is, let's assume, a nasty piece of work, selfish, greedy, and callously indifferent to the fate of his father. If someone proposed a way for him to murder his father that had a good chance of going undetected, he would agree to it in a minute. But he's not very bright or imaginative, and so no plan or attempt materializes. When the woman reflects critically on her friend's lack of punctuality, or the uncle on her nephew's vicious character, do their judgments and attitudes constitute instances of blame, even though there's no particular event or action they're blaming the respective objects of their reflections for? Opinion might divide in answer to these questions, and many of us might feel, at least initially, torn. On the one hand, it seems linguistically required that when one blames someone, there must always be some act or state of affairs that one is blaming the individual for. And it seems possible simply to notice that someone has a fault, or even a vice, without necessarily blaming him for it. One might observe that a person has a certain trait which one registers as undesirable or bad, and just leave it at that. One may take notice of a person's flaws, for instance, but regard him with Strawson's objective attitude. On the other hand, we are not always so dispassionate and sanguine when we consider people's faults, especially when the people in question are family members or friends. Often, we do not just notice that someone has a fault, we criticize him for it. That is, we take a critical attitude toward him, which we may or may not express. Criticism, like blame, seems to involve, or at least license, one's taking a negative affective attitude of some kind. One might be annoyed by a colleague's laziness, disgusted by a friend's sloppiness, appalled by a sibling's political opinions. And people do sometimes speak of blaming a person simply for being a certain way. Indeed, some philosophers suggest that blame is always at bottom of this sort. Though we might say we are blaming someone for acting selfishly or obnoxiously, they would argue, the act is merely the occasion which calls attention to the fault for which the person is really being blamed. Is criticism, then, a species of blame, or is it something different? I shall argue that it's different, but lest one think that this is merely a question of linguistic niceties, let me explain why I think there's something philosophically significant at stake. Earlier, I drew attention to a cluster of ideas that we commonly employ to contrast two kinds of individuals and two corresponding sets of attitudes and judgments that we apply towards them. Some individuals are responsible agents, others are not. The appropriateness of blame and praise, punishment and reward, of the reactive attitudes are restricted to the domain of responsible agents. Non-responsible individuals, by contrast, may be proper objects of social policy. They may be managed or handled or cured or trained. They may be pitied or feared, avoided or enjoyed, but only in ways that can be embraced while taking an objective attitude toward them. If we accept the contrast, then the question of how to classify or understand criticism presents us with two options. If we think of criticism on the model of one who simply dispassionately notices that an individual has a regrettable trait or feature, we can call this the just saying model. Then we may place criticism on the non-responsible side of the divide. To criticize, according to this conception, is to ascribe a negatively valued feature to someone. When one criticizes something, one need make no assumption that the object of criticism is a responsible agent, much less that the individual is responsible for the specific trait being ascribed to it. One can, on this conception, criticize a book for being boring, or a train for being slow. Further, one can criticize a person for being clumsy or stupid or ugly, as well as for being selfish or pompous or mean. On the other hand, if we think of criticism as involving something more than mere negative description, and as involving or licensing affective attitudes like annoyance, moral disgust, and contempt, then it seems we should place it on the opposite side of the contrast. Criticism on this conception is a kind of blame, or at least a kind of response to an object that's in the neighborhood of blame. The attitudes that seem reasonably to accompany or follow from the attribution of viciousness to an individual are, according to that view, as reactive as those that respond to specific acts that reflect such viciousness. To regard someone as an appropriate object of criticism thus presupposes that the individual is a responsible agent, just as much as does regarding someone as an appropriate object of paradigmatic blame. But if, as I think, neither of these conceptions of criticism is acceptable, it suggests that there is something wrong with the contrast that dictates that these are the only options there are. There is, I shall argue, a quite familiar kind of criticism that cannot be accommodated by the just saying model. It is not dispassionate, and it is in tension with the objective attitude with which paradigmatically non-responsible beings must be regarded. But neither does it conform to the standard model of blame, and the differences between it and standard blame are not trivial. Importantly, the conditions that justify standard blame are different from those that make criticism appropriate. So different that one can conceive of beings who are capable of deserving the one but not the other, and vice versa. This suggests that the concept of responsibility is not so unified and straightforward as it is typically assumed to be, and that there is not one contrast but two between the objective attitude and the attitudes of involvement or participation in human relationships. In light of this, as we'll see, new puzzles arise about how we should understand punishment, as well as about how to think about the age-old philosophical problem of free will. Just as there are broader and narrower uses of the words responsibility and blame, there are broader and narrower uses of criticism that make it difficult to clearly establish the features of the category I wish to call attention to. Still, I hope that the inadequacy of the just saying model of criticism as a category that captures all standard uses of the term will be relatively easy to see. When we observe that a person has bad skin, for example, we attribute a fault or defect to her, which we nonetheless don't criticize her for. If we believe that Kant was a brilliant philosopher, but that his metaphysical and ethical views are nonetheless mistaken, we might criticize Kant's philosophical positions, but not criticize him. And although it seems reasonable and appropriate to criticize a person for being indifferent to the suffering of others, it seems totally misguided to criticize a crocodile or killer whale for this trait. But since bad skin, bad metaphysics, and indifference to human suffering are undesirable features for any individual to have, this shows that criticism, in one sense at least, must involve something more than the attribution of an undesirable trait to an individual. These considerations, indeed, all seem to support the idea that criticism, or at least an important sense of criticism, belongs on the other side of the contrast, to be classified, if not as a form of blame, at least as being in that neighborhood. Like blame, criticism involves or allows affective attitudes like annoyance and contempt. Like blame, only certain sorts of individuals, nephews yes, crocodiles no, seem capable of deserving it. It seems plausible to think that regarding someone as an appropriate object of criticism presupposes the individual's being a responsible agent just as much as does regarding him as an appropriate object of blame. And our criticisms of ourselves and each other for being, for example, closed-minded, pretentious, obnoxious, or cruel, along with our pride and admiration for people who are generous, kind, imaginative, or brave, fit just as much into the range of reactive feelings and attitudes which belong to involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships as do the reactive attitudes Strawson explicitly mentioned, such as resentment, indignation, and gratitude. For these reasons, I'm inclined to classify criticism and shame, admiration and pride, or at least the kinds of criticism, admiration, and so on with which I'm concerned, as belonging to the range of reactive attitudes that reflect our interaction with others as potential members of our interpersonal communities. To regard someone as a fit object of criticism, then, is to regard him as being an individual of a certain kind, which for the moment we can identify with responsible agency. And to regard someone as a fit object of criticism for having a particular feature or for committing a particular act is, correspondingly, to regard him as having a kind of relationship to that feature or act, which, for the moment, we can call one of responsibility. This seems to explain the fact that it's appropriate to criticize the nephew for his indifference to human suffering, but not the crocodile, as well as the fact that it's appropriate to criticize one's friend for always being late, but not, say, for always sneezing during hay fever season. But before agreeing that these considerations place criticism in the neighborhood or family of blame, we need to look more closely at what it is about the difference between a person and a crocodile, and about a person's relation to her tardiness and her relation to her hay fever, that makes them respectively criticizable or not. In virtue of what is it appropriate or fitting that we can criticize a person for being indifferent to suffering, but not appropriate to criticize a crocodile or a killer whale? And in virtue of what is it appropriate to criticize a person for being perpetually tardy, but not appropriate to criticize a person for being allergic to pollen? It's tempting to answer such questions by reference to people's alleged control over the traits and acts for which they are being considered for criticism. Crocodiles can't help the fact that they are indifferent to suffering, after all, and it's not up to us whether we have allergies. And so we might be inclined to think that this is the key to explaining the differences in our reactions to these cases and those with which we contrast them. But I think the answer has less to do with the individual's control over what he is or does than with the kinds of reasons for being or acting differently to which he is susceptible. Thus, for example, at the risk of being frivolous, let us reconsider the crocodile. It may be true that the crocodile can't help being indifferent to human suffering, but what if he could help it? The crocodile, I would argue, has no reason not to be indifferent, and this is sufficient to eliminate any basis for criticism independently of the issue of control. Similarly, I would argue that an alien from outer space might have no reason not to be indifferent to us, making it similarly inappropriate to criticize him, even though he has as much control over his attitudes and behavior as we do. Further, it seems to me that there are cases where criticism is appropriate even when control is lacking. To see this, let's consider our attitude to a friend who, instead of being perpetually tardy, is an inveterate sexist. He applies double standards in his judgments of men's and women's characters. He's much less likely to take women's ideas seriously than men's, and he's frequently amused by incidents that one finds appalling. Is one critical of one's friend for this? Of course. And yet, it doesn't seem to me that we need to assume or believe that our friend's views about women are subject to his control. Perhaps he was brought up in a community where these attitudes were nearly universally accepted, and this has shaped his continuing perception in ways he may not even be aware of. If so, and if his sexist perceptions are not under his control, then the salient feature that makes him subject to criticism is not that it's up to him to be a sexist or not to be. Rather, it's that there are reasons not to be a sexist that he has the capacity to appreciate that he's failing to recognize. The same, of course, could be said of one's tardy friend. Like the sexist, she has reasons not to be tardy that she fails to appreciate, whereas in the case of her allergies, the idea that they reflect a failure to appreciate reasons can get no purchase. This suggestion is just a first stab at characterizing the conditions or assumptions under which criticism may be appropriate. No doubt it needs clarification, explanation, and qualification in order to be adequate. But if it's on the right track, it suggests a feature of responsible agency that is independently plausible. Specifically, to be a fit subject of criticism, according to this suggestion, one must be an individual that can be sensitive to reasons of a certain sort. In order to be appropriately criticizable for being a sexist or for being cruel, one must be the kind of being that is capable of understanding and appreciating reasons not to be sexist or cruel. Indeed, I'm inclined to say that one cannot even be sexist or cruel if one is not that kind of being. A dog that for some reason has been traumatized or programmed to respond differently to men and to women would still not be a sexist. And though crocodiles are indifferent to human suffering, they cannot be callously indifferent. Insofar as we identify being responsible with being a potential member of an interpersonal community, it's plausible that this should be a condition. For an interpersonal community is a community within which one may find one's friends and lovers, and it's plausible that such relations require a shared universe of possible perceptions and reasons within which one can communicate and exchange ideas, values, and other responses to the world around one. This may sound at first as if it's the same condition as that which is needed to make blame appropriate, for it is generally acknowledged that it would be wrong to blame someone for doing something if the person blamed wasn't able to understand and appreciate why she shouldn't have done it. But recalling the remarks I made a moment ago about the relation between criticism and control suggests that the conditions of criticism are different from the conditions, at least of paradigmatic blame. My description of the sexist was intended specifically to show that a person could be appropriately criticized even if he lacked control over the feature he was criticized for. It need not, at least in the short run, be in the man's power not to be sexist. This is not a feature that is under the direct control of his will. And given his upbringing and the makeup of his social world, we may grant that one could not have reasonably expected him to be or to have been any different. This does not, to my mind, make criticism inappropriate. It is still bad or wrong to hold sexist attitudes, and the man in question is, by stipulation, still capable of appreciating the reasons why. nor need we register his sexism in an exclusively cool and detached way, taking the objective attitude, as it were, to men of a certain age or from a certain background. We may argue with him if we think it worth our while, or to invoke a contrast of Strawson's, we may reason with him and not just negotiate with him. Alternatively, we may recoil from him, as we recoil from people with other vices, for his being, let us say, a smug, chauvinist jerk. But although the consideration that his sexism is not under his control does not block our criticism, it does seem to me to block the appropriateness of blame. Indeed, it's precisely considerations like these that are likely to make those of us who are initially tempted to blame someone for his sexism or his sexist behavior withdraw our blame. Many philosophers have suggested, plausibly, that this is because of the close relationship between blame and sanctions. Blaming people licenses demands for such things as apology, compensation, and punishment, according to the case at issue. And it seems unfair to impose or demand such things of an individual if she's unable to avoid being subject to them. The idea is often discussed in connection with the notion of accountability. The philosopher Gary Watson, as those of you who were here yesterday will remember, has suggested that when you blame someone, you hold her accountable, which is to be understood in terms of practices that assign specifiable tasks or expectations to particular individuals with an understanding, common to all parties involved, that if the individuals fail to perform these tasks or to live up to these expectations, they will be subject to sanctions. Such practices may be more or less explicit, but all cases of accountability refer, at least implicitly, to a norm or standard which one party is expected to abide by and which another party is in a position to demand that she do. Although not every case of holding accountable for something bad need be a case of blaming, every case of blaming is a case of holding accountable. This helps explain why, in many instances, criticism is appropriate but blame is not, and why, if blame is appropriate, it may indicate that a particular kind of relationship is in place. For example, we may criticize someone but not blame him for being a slob or for being pretentious or for being a poor philosopher. Because even if we disapprove of these traits and the patterns of behavior that issue from them, it may be none of our business whether the object of our criticism possesses them. They're not accountable to us to be neat or down to earth or to marshal better philosophical arguments. Unless perhaps the slob is your housemate, or the bad philosopher, an academic opponent, spreading a caricaturized version of your views. Further, it can explain why we are less likely to blame someone for being a certain way, for being selfish or dishonest or sexist, for example, than for doing things that manifest these traits, such as stealing or lying or discriminating against women. For we often think that a person can't help being, as it may be, selfish or mean or sexist, but that he can help acting on his selfish, mean, or sexist impulses, and so blaming him for these actions may not be unfair. These reflections confirm and shed light on the observation that criticism is distinct from blame, but they do little to support the claims of disunity I made earlier about the concept of responsibility and the category of the reactive attitudes. For it's compatible with the observations I've made so far that one think that blame is distinct from criticism only in requiring a stronger kind of responsibility, and that the conditions of appropriate blame include the conditions of criticism, differing from them only in requiring something more. Indeed, among the relatively few philosophers who agree that there's more than one kind of deep, more than merely causal responsibility, this seems to be the standard position. As I discussed in yesterday's lecture, Gary Watson has proposed that we recognize two senses of responsibility, which he associates with the notions of attributability and accountability, respectively. To regard someone as responsible for something in the attributability sense, he suggests, is to regard the thing as disclosing something about the person's self. Judgments of personal character, including critical judgments, are examples of attributability. But to hold someone responsible in a way that legitimates blame and sanctions is, as we've already seen, to invoke the idea of accountability. According to Watson, it appears that an individual is accountable for something only if, in addition to its being attributable to him, there is a person or group to whom he is accountable, and the individual has the ability to avoid being subject to the sanctions that failure to conform to the relevant standards or expectations would, in these circumstances, expose him to. On such a view, responsibility is unified after all, even though there are weaker and stronger forms of it. Critical judgments and attitudes, and their positive correlates, such as admiration and esteem, are appropriate as long as an act or a trait is attributable to someone. When, in addition, the individual has the ability to do otherwise, and there are practices of accountability in place, the individual may also be justly subject to blame or credit, punishment or reward. Being a potential object of criticism, then, is conceived as a necessary but insufficient condition of being accountable and blameworthy. And if one thinks that considerations of determinism imply that no one is responsible in the strong sense necessary for accountability and the justifiability of blame, it may be some consolation that people can at least be seen to possess a weaker kind of responsibility sufficient to justify judgments and attitudes of criticism and admiration. But this view is mistaken. Once we've teased apart the conditions of criticism from the conditions of blame, and more specifically, once we've seen how closely the appropriateness of blame is linked to accountability, we can see that the category of individuals who can be accountable for things and that of beings who are subject to criticism do not line up as neatly as this view would claim. Moreover, this will give us reason to question the idea that blame is a stronger attitude or range of attitudes than criticism, resting on a stronger set of conditions, so that even if blame is rendered problematic by the problem of determinism, criticism and its opposites are not under threat. To persuade you, let us look at some kinds of individuals who are appropriately held accountable, but who are not paradigmatic of fully responsible agents. Recall that for individuals to be accountable, there must be practices in place that hold individuals to sanctions if they do not conform to specifiable norms or expectations. To be an appropriate candidate for accountability requires the ability to understand these practices and to control one's behavior in light of them. Normal adult human beings, therefore, are paradigmatic candidates for accountability. But now, consider organizations, such as corporations and states. Organizations like these are also capable of registering that they are expected to conform to specified norms and standards. They are capable of recognizing that they will be subject to sanctions and other costs if they do not comply. Further, they may have decision procedures in place that allow them to choose whether to abide by the norms and standards expected of them or not, in light of the costs they risk incurring. And indeed, in practice, we do hold corporations and states both morally and legally accountable for things, demanding that in certain circumstances they compensate victims for their objectionable actions and policies, punishing them with sanctions, boycotts, and public condemnations, and even in some cases demanding that they apologize. So if being responsible is to be identified with being such as to be potentially held accountable for things, corporations and states are responsible. Further, the fact that we regard corporations and states as appropriate objects of sanctions seems to support the idea that corporations and states can be appropriate objects of blame. In addition, we might consider the status of sociopaths, understanding sociopaths to be individuals completely lacking the capacity for empathy. Like organizations, sociopaths can participate in practices of accountability, They can understand what norms they are expected to conform to and what penalties they are liable to if they do not comply. And in light of this, they can weigh the costs and benefits of following these norms in deciding what to do. If they violate these norms and get caught for doing so, it's not unfair to hold them accountable. They knew what they were risking. But it seems to me that reactive attitudes towards them on the basis of these violations would be completely out of place. When we resent or feel indignant or get angry at people for ignoring or even intentionally defeating our interests, it's because we think they are failing to attend to reasons they have for taking us into account. Reasons perhaps for recognizing and respecting us as ends in ourselves, having to do with our status as the offender's moral equals. People who lack the capacity for empathy, however, have no more reason to regard us this way than crocodiles. We should regard such people as we regard crocodiles with only the objective attitude. What needs to be emphasized is that whereas they are like crocodiles in being appropriately regarded with only the objective attitude, they are quite unlike crocodiles in being capable of being and being held to be accountable. Our concept of responsibility thus seems to break apart. For if we identify responsibility with accountability, sociopaths will be classified as responsible beings. But insofar as responsibility is associated with being an appropriate object of reactive attitudes, sociopaths are excluded. What about the converse possibility? Are there individuals who can be appropriate objects of reactive attitudes, but who are not capable of being accountable? We've already seen, as in the case of our inveterate sexist, that a person may not be accountable for a particular feature that can nonetheless be a basis for the reactive attitudes that accompany criticism. One may be morally disgusted by a person's sexism without thinking he is appropriately subject to blame for it. But although the sexist is not accountable for his sexism, we may presume that he is accountable for much else, including abiding by laws and policies prohibiting sex discrimination and sexual harassment. Still, I'm skeptical that the abilities needed for accountability always are necessary for criticizability and attributability. Among the sorts of cases that fuel my doubts are young children, people with certain sorts of cognitive disabilities, and those with certain kinds of mental illness. For people in any of these categories may lack a degree of capacity for self-control or for practical deliberation necessary to be fairly held accountable for acting in accordance with specifiable norms. And yet this does not seem to keep them from having characters that reflect their sensitivity and appreciation of reasons to, for example, share one's toys with one's sister or to try to help a stranger who has fallen in the street. The character assessments that Watson discusses that can ground judgments and attitudes of criticism and disdain, and also of praise and affection, judgments and attitudes that are as important to being able to include someone in one's interpersonal community as the ability to hold them accountable, may be less closely connected to the capacities of practical deliberative reason and control than one might have supposed. To sum up, then, it seems to me that there is at least one significant fault line in the idea of responsibility that mostly goes unrecognized. One important cluster of capacities makes possible qualities that ground judgments and attitudes of a certain warm, reactive kind of criticism and praise. These are capacities, as I put it, to be sensitive and appreciative of, and indeed to have, certain sorts of reasons, capacities that distinguish most adult human beings from infants and crocodiles, but also from sociopaths and corporations. There is, I believe, a strong case to be made for the idea that to be a deeply responsible being is to be the kind of being who is appropriately criticizable. Although I don't have time to argue for this today, I believe that only beings of this sort are capable of having a genuine character and of having the kind of self whose disclosure Watson's notion of attributability responsibility is meant to capture. Individuals who lack these capacities entirely are to be viewed with only the objective attitude. They can be objects of social policy, they can be managed and handled, or perhaps simply avoided. But they are not rightly objects of the range of reactive feelings and attitudes which belong to involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships. But curiously, and somewhat surprisingly, some of the individuals in this latter group can be held accountable for things. We may expect them to act according to certain norms and sanction them if they fail to do so. This suggests that the capacity that makes one a potential member of practices of accountability constitute a second cluster. This cluster, too, distinguishes most adult human beings from infants and crocodiles, but for different reasons. And although it does not exclude sociopaths and corporations, it may exclude 3-year-olds and schizophrenics, while the other group may not. Where, then, shall we locate the appropriateness of blame? Is blame a form or expression of accountability? Is it a kind of criticism? Or is blame a combination of both practices, depending on having the capacities necessary for both accountability and criticism? The language of blame is elastic enough that a case can be made for any of these answers, and it's too late in the day to examine and weigh the reasons supporting one choice rather than another. But because I mentioned near the beginning of this talk that I thought the ideas that I would be presenting had implications for the way we understand punishment and for the problem of free will, let me conclude with some very brief remarks to indicate what I meant by that. Regarding punishment, my main thought was this. Since punishments are sanctions, theories and practices of punishment should be concerned chiefly with issues of accountability. If an individual is accountable, he's potentially a fit subject of punishment, and his punishment should be set by the specifics of the practices of accountability that are in place. How good or bad his character is, in virtue of which he may have been led to commit an act deserving of punishment, is not directly relevant to the question of whether he is accountable and for what. But the warmer reactive attitudes that typically inform our desire for punishment and our judgment of how much punishment an offending party deserves typically, if not always, depends on our criticism of the offender. To fairly determine whether and how much an individual is deserving of punishment, we should, I think, distinguish our assessments of whether the individual is accountable for his behavior from that of whether and how much he deserves criticism for it. And we must ask whether it is the business of the punishing agent, a parent, perhaps, an employer, or a state, to criticize as well as to punish. More generally, we may need to develop an ethics of criticism distinct from an ethics of punishment that looks not only at the conditions under which criticism may be deserved, but also at the ethical principles and concerns that should govern the public expression of criticism. And what about the problem of free will? For centuries, that problem has been centrally occupied with the question of whether the possibility of determinism, or alternatively mechanism, compromises our ability to do otherwise, or undermines the belief that what we do is under our control in a relevant sense. These concerns are taken to raise questions about whether people can ever be deserving of blame and punishment, whether, in light of the distinction I've been arguing for, they can ever rightly be held accountable for anything. But once we've distinguished accountability from criticizability, this way of understanding the problem seems puzzling. Earlier, I pointed out that the kinds of individuals that can participate in practices of accountability include not only adult human beings, but organizations like corporations and states. But does anyone really think that considerations of determinism might undermine the accountability of organizations and states? Might metaphysics render the oil companies invulnerable to justifiable sanctions? If there is, as I believe, a philosophical difficulty about how to think about and regard ourselves in light of the possibility of determinism, then perhaps it is not because it threatens accountability, but rather the idea that we are criticizable in a way that goes beyond the just saying model. But this turns out to have relatively little to do with the ability to do otherwise. The problem lies rather elsewhere. It's regrettable to end my lecture with such large and sketchy speculations. This, you might think, is where the real philosophy begins, making you wish that I had gotten to these points more quickly, leaving myself more time to develop them. Since I'm not literally accountable to you for giving you a more brilliant and edifying lecture, you cannot justifiably blame me for this. But this is small comfort, since you can rightly criticize me, which from my point of view is both better and worse.
Thank you very much. Time for questions and comments. Matt?
Thank you. I had a question about the inveterate sexist, and I wasn't sure in the end. So you think the inveterate sexist is open to sort of warm criticism, is open to negative reactive attitudes? And I agree with that, but you think that depends on him being capable of recognizing reasons for not having the attitudes that he has?
Yeah, the word I used was appreciating.
Appreciate, okay.
Yeah,
and
right.
That, and I won't go into why, but that's a claim that I want to reject. But in this context, I would just ask, the inveterate sexist, the way you characterize him, he's not at fault for having the attitudes that he has. And I think you said that he can't be expected. It wouldn't be reasonable to expect him to not have those attitudes. So I'm wondering what what you have in mind by capability of appreciating, and what work that's doing. And I would think that, you know, if we were to continue, I'd push on it and say that seems like such a thin notion of capability that it's not doing much work, and we'd be better off just saying, look, he's open to negative reactive attitudes because of the content of the attitudes that he has, the judgments that are expressed, you know, through his behavior, etc. Right.
Yes. I'm aware that I need to explain and develop this more, and that it sounds like I'm trying to make a very thin and maybe dubious distinction. So, yeah. I guess the first thing I want to say is there's a distinction between let's go back to the difference between this sexist, and the dog, who has been conditioned to respond differently to men and women, badly to women, let's say. Right? My claim there, and I guess I'll see whether you go along with this, is look, the dog isn't a sexist, can't be a sexist, while the man can be. What's different? It's not the behavior, obviously, right? I guess I think it's the man's cognitive capacities that, you know. So this is where I want to say what the man has and the dog lacks is the capacity to understand women differently from the way he does understand women. And it's only against that background that we regard him as a yucky sexist, right? The yuckiness being the reactive attitude, my way of referring to, not just does he have this negative feature, but it's a negative feature for which reacting warmly is appropriate, right? Not so with the dog, right? So that's really what I'm getting at as the capacity, right? He has, right? And it's only against that background that it makes sense to have a reactive attitude, right? Okay, so that's the capacity. I don't think that's too thin a sense, right? On the other hand, depending on the background and history of the person, it does seem to me that's totally compatible with saying, well, what would you expect given where he's come to this point? So let me start with that and see where you want to kind of...
With respect to the man and the dog, I would say, well, look, the difference is that it makes sense to attribute judgments to the man that it doesn't make sense to attribute to the dog. And we can attribute those judgments, those sexist attitudes, even if they're not revisable, and for the man. And I think the kind of man that we're talking about might be one, and I guess the disagreement might be that when we agree that, yeah, it's not reasonable to expect him to get it right, I want to say, well, maybe he has a capacity to get it right in some sense, but that's not doing much of the work grounding blame. What's doing the work of grounding the blame is just the attribution to him of these objectionable attitudes.
Okay, so I want to say the fact that he has the capacity, but that it's not under his control, whether the capacity actually has yielded successful results, is a reason that he shouldn't be blamed. So blame is not available on either of these cases, to me. Right?
I mean resentment. So the warm
me
attitudes.
too. Criticism is different, I think. So we'll right. So trying to keep that hold of that distinction. My thought is, look, you can't blame him, but you can still respond to him as like, I don't, you're a creep, and I'm gonna not hang out with you or something, right? Or I could argue with him. I could fight with him. I could, all of those things. So the thought is, like, I didn't want to say he can't be changed, or I might have used the word inveterate. I think I did use the word inveterate, but I didn't mean cannot be changed. If he has the capacity, he can. I think it is possible that he change. But so there are two things. But I guess one thing I want to stress, and that I think often, well, I don't know whether you agree with or not, is that change of how you see things, right? How you see women and men, how you see things you're used to seeing one way, to change not just a belief or a judgment, but how you see things is often gradual and is not under your control. I mean, you can make some efforts, right? You can read more work, listen to more things, watching a movie, having a friend talk to you, things change. There are things that explain why you do change when, if eventually you do change, but they don't necessarily work right away. They're not, right, we can't really control them, right? So that's what I'm thinking is the situation with the sexist here, and with all of us about many things, right? And so the thought is, as long as you're in the ballpark of someone who's capable, in my sense, of getting it, right, then criticism is appropriate. But blame might not be, because you can't just, have them turn on the basis of a judgment. So, right. So I guess the thought is, it's not just a judgment that differentiates the dog from the sexist. We could turn to the sociopath, I suppose, to say, look, sociopaths can make all kinds of judgments, but that's not enough either, I think, to be. So.
Okay.
He was first here. Yes, sir.
Yes, okay.
Thank you. You've drawn a very complex picture, but I still like to complicate it further by sort of asking you about something you haven't talked about. And it's about, I think we sort of, in some cases, apply different standards to ourselves than we expect others to apply to us, and harsher standards to ourselves. And I think they could be illustrated by Bernard Williams' famous case by agent regret. But I won't do that because it hasn't happened to me. So since I've been talking about things from my own perspective, from the first person perspective, I'd like to sort of talk about something that happened to myself. I was once invited, when I was visiting in New York, I was invited to give a talk at UMass at Amherst. And I had to take a train from New York to Amherst, actually to to Springfield, and Fred Feldman picked me up there. And there was a terrible snowstorm, and the train was 3 hours late. So I didn't know Feldman very well, but I knew he was sort of sitting at Springfield station waiting for the train, which was 3 hours late. And I was extremely embarrassed. And of course I said, I'm terribly sorry. And I really was terribly sorry. But at the same time, I would have thought he would have been extremely unreasonable if he had criticized me or blamed me in any way, because I was, I couldn't do anything about it.
Right.
So in this sort of case, I apply a certain harsh standard to myself. I feel sort of embarrassed, sort of blamable in some way, but still I expect other people not to blame me. And I think the same is true of William's case of agent regret, although fortunately I've never run over a child accidentally, so I don't know how, but
only on purpose.
Yeah, only on purpose.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, and got away with it. But I expect I would find it impossible to shake off a sort of guilt and a feeling of blameworthiness. Although I would think that it would be very unreasonable for other people to regard me as deeply blameworthy and so on. So I think we apply simultaneously different standards to ourselves, depending on whether we view it from the inside, so to speak, or other people looking at us. Thank you.
So, well, for better or for worse, I've actually thought a lot about moral luck and about these issues, and have written many pages about this. I certainly agree with the observation that that the attitudes we impose on ourselves are quite different, and appropriately so, than the ones that it would be justified for someone else in such cases to apply. But I would say, first of all, no one, neither you nor Feldman, should blame you for being late due to a snowstorm. What you feel terrible, you feel embarrassed, you are right to apologize even though it wasn't your fault. He is right to say, look, of course it wasn't your fault, and I have no hard feelings. But I think agent regret is different from blame or criticism. There's nothing you're criticizable for either until it comes, I mean, this is my view, until it comes to how you respond to the fact that you were 3 hours late and you kept this person waiting in the Springfield train station for so long. At that point, had you not apologized, that would have been pretty bad. Then you would have been subject to criticism. I mean, had you not said, I feel terrible about, I mean, you should feel terrible because you were the cause of it, right? You shouldn't blame yourself, right? And you should apologize. I mean, I'm maybe over.
I haven't got anything to apologize for. I couldn't tell.
Well, so, right. Some people don't want to apologize at that point. To me, I use apology pretty broadly to say, I created this, incredible inconvenience for you, Well, okay. Well, then maybe then I don't know why you did feel so bad. I thought it was appropriate to feel bad because we cause things even though we don't intentionally cause them, and it seems to me a part of human virtue that we should, as it were, take some kind of responsibility for things even though they're not always necessarily our fault. So against the background of that virtue, it seems appropriate for you to feel bad, to express your regrets, but I wouldn't call that blame or criticism because there was no fault there. Where there would be a fault is if you do this, or more obviously, if you run over a child accidentally through no fault of your own and don't feel terrible and impelled to try to do something to, I don't know, redeem yourself, make amends, express your regret. But that's not for the running over of the child, but for your response to the fact that you ran over a child. So, yeah, I guess I don't feel like that actually gets in any problematic way into the distinction I was mainly talking about today.
Thank you. So I have a question about the notion of accountability and the way you use it. So in the literature, for some people, what's really important about accountability is the connection to deserved blame and deserved suffering. And for others, it's more to a kind of practice of holding accountable, which is demanding certain kinds of responses and so on, right? And it seemed to me that much of what you said latched on to the second strand of this and not to the first. And so I wonder where the first strand ends up, because it's the one that's typically tied to free will issues.
Right.
So it was to some extent passed over in this presentation, to some extent. And so if you have the corporation case, you might think that, yeah, sure, we should have a practice of holding corporations accountable for broadly consequentialist reasons. It makes for a good society. I mean, it would be bad not to hold them accountable and let them operate freely. And it's good to have them operate in society. So we need some system that holds them accountable. But that doesn't mean that they deserve punishment in the sense that we think that a bad human being might deserve punishment for what they do. So it's the notion of basic desert for some people in literature. So can you say a little more about those two strands and how they relate to what you're saying here?
Yes, good. Right, it's true that by the end of the paper, when I'm talking about accountability, as you say, I'm talking about it. Look, what does accountability amount to? It amounts to these practices which require certain capacities that corporations have as well as human beings. There are conditions of when it's just. I would use the word just to, when can you hold a corporation accountable and for what? I mean, there are issues there, I think, of justice and desert. But it's a thin sense of desert. Like, the person deserves punishment if the person, the corporation, the whatever, an individual deserves punishment if he broke a rule that he was aware of, that he knew what was at stake and could determine, and had control over whether to obey the rule and so on. So that's a kind of justice and desert, period, I think. So it's not just consequent.
Right.
Practice might be justified by consequentialist reasoning, but the desert isn't directly.
Okay, good.
Okay, so there's that. And then, as you say, there's a lot of people think, no, what I mean by accountability is and blameworthiness involves this deeper thing, right? So, though I didn't, I think, say this clearly, what I do think is that once you recognize that attributability is a deeper thing, it turns out that's what the deeper kind of accountability was relying on. Mm-hmm. So I guess I think once you get clear on on this other stuff, what people thought was all accountability, turns out the pressure is actually not where they thought it was, and therefore it's not on the control issue at all. So to just go back one more place.
It's very interesting.
So at the very beginning I said, what does it take? What do we do when we're blaming? In the paradigm cases, what we do is we see some individual as having done something wrong, which we assume or infer is a result of a fault that they had, right? And it's the it's because it issued from this fault that we tend to want them to be punished, and that we want them to be punished a lot or a little, depending on how.
Right.
Right. And that attribution of the fault, I think, is more about attributability. So that's.
Okay. Okay. No, thank you.
Dan, har du Paul på din lista?
Sorry?
Har du Paul på din lista? För han var i början.
Okay. Sorry,
Susan, I found this the distinction as you were talking about yesterday overlaps the accountability attributability distinction. I'm interested in that and want to come back to that, especially in the, as it were, there's maybe some kind of this is what I'd like you to say more about, the kind of tension between your original observation that the area of our concept of responsibility is messier and less clean and less neat than a lot of people suppose. I'm very sympathetic to that. That's a kind of Williamsy observation itself. And the distinction between accountability and attributability, which looks like a kind of something, and the criticism versus blame distinction that tracks that, looks like something neater and sharper. And I'm interested in that distinction as it relates to criticism and the expression of criticism and retribution. So what I'm thinking of here is, let's suppose we've got this horrible sexist. Let's just call it Donald, to take a totally hypothetical example. So you've got Donald, and you realize, Donald, I was thinking of using Jojo for reasons that you could probably appreciate, but let's call it Donald. Let's call this person Donald. And you have to figure out, well, poor old Donald, there's absolutely no chance of Donald really being under stronger control and being different than what he is. So in this sense, I take it, this is part of your concern here, but we can still sort of say something about Donald is still sensitive to these reasons enough to understand what's going on. But so one way it might be is I privately blame. One way of talking this way is you might say, I privately blame this Donald. I'm not going to sanction Donald because Donald can't do anything about it. It doesn't have this deeper control that's required for retribution and accountability and so on and so forth. But I certainly have this kind of strong criticism of Donald. Now, isn't the first thing that happens here in terms of dealing with someone like that is you want to say, well, I don't want to have to socialize with a creep like that. So then you've got the notion here that, as it were, how do I express, or what are the constraints? You raised this issue yourself about what are the kinds of constraints on the way I treat Donald in light of my criticism that's short of blame. And this is where I'd like you to say something more, because something you might think of blame as involving, and this is what goes on with the accountability talk, is accountability might have some kind of notion that the sort of treatment that's involved is something like strong retributivism. Like, if Donald is really blameworthy, then he just deserves to suffer for being a creep. That's like strong retributive intuition. But you might have a weaker retributive intuition, which is if Donald is blameworthy, then at least he's liable to harsh treatment if we can provide some further utilitarian justification. That's something like a negative or retributive or permissive retributive view. But there might be something even short of that, which is I might just want to express my distaste for Donald by, as you said, not socializing with him, but I do harm someone by ostracizing them, especially if my other colleagues converge on that. So here's my concern here, which is there are a lot of different things that come under this heading of expression moving into retribution and what is retributive. Is it just this kind of, is the criticism-blame distinction as it relates to retribution? What are the fault lines here? Because there's quite a, as you were saying, and I agree, it's much messier than something as simple as liable to retribution or not liable to retribution.
I see things in a very different way from the way you've just talked about it. And I guess the first thing to say to try to get at that is you were presenting the options of how to respond to Donald as a kind of continuum with retributive blame at one end, right? Something, then there was something milder, I'm not sure what it was exactly. Maybe
Well, I think it's
consequentialist
something like a
blame or
strong
something?
Kantian, Susan, I'm thinking of something like a strong Kantian, that if someone is blameworthy, like an extreme case, a murderer deserves
Yeah, no, I know
to
what
die.
retributive
So it's
blame is. Well, then there was something else, and then at the end was
Well, then there was something
was
like
not socializing.
Well, then a weaker view, you might reject strong positive retributivism as simply barbaric.
Right.
And you might then, but nevertheless, take something like a weaker view, which is, nevertheless, if you are blameworthy in that sense, you are liable to certain kinds of harsh sanctions and treatments for
good.
utilitarian, and that's still within the scope of punishment.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so you've got, your view is we've got retributive blame, then we have accountability, punishments, sanctions that are not for their own sake, but they're they're justified by and then there's, at the weekend is, I don't want to hang around with you, which is what, right, and you think of these as sanctions, all of them as sanctions, going from the hardest to the weakest, or at least as degrees of something, right? Where for me, so there are two different things I want to say. One is, I don't want to hang around with you, or you're a creep. I don't think of that as a sanction at all. That's just interpersonal relationships. I'm not imposing something on you for the sake of anything in particular. It doesn't seem to me to be punishment. It may be at least as harsh. You might suffer. I mean, the person might, I think for lots of people, think of parent-child relationships too, the fact that someone criticizes might be much worse than that someone punishes you in terms of how bad it feels. But whether it's a punishment is not a question of how bad it feels. And so that can be much worse. It's not weaker. And it's not weaker, and it's not a sanction at all. But to come at it from a different angle, in fact, the history of my coming to this example of the sexist did start with a less fictionalized Donald, and this was at the time of, before he was elected president, when there was a report of his groping some woman on an airplane, which somehow made no difference at all to the voters. But I just thought, oh my, right. So on the one hand, one reacts with, what a creep, right? But it seems to me, I don't know exactly what year it was, but I believe there were laws in place saying you can't do this all along. And presumably he knew there was such a law, or ought to have known. I mean, you're allowed, this is not non-culpable ignorance, right? So I think you can absolutely blame him, hold him accountable, all of that for the action. I don't have any problem with that, right? I kind of backed down because that wasn't really where in this paper I adjusted it in ways that make it less easy to say, look, you can certainly blame him for that, and you can blame him for that, I think, even if you think he can't help but be a sexist, right? He can still know, sexist or not. The fact that he is a sexist and possibly a sociopath. So this is it's kind of overdetermined here, right? Means that he might not understand, like from the inside, like, I don't get it. Like, what's wrong with this? Why shouldn't I do this? Right? But he knows that he shouldn't do it, and he knows he's liable, and so that's enough for him to be accountable. It's not enough for him to be criticizable. It's only if you think he's not a sociopath, and he is capable of getting it, he just doesn't get it, that he's criticizable. So I guess I just think they really do, to me. I mean, I agree they're not neat or clean, and most of the time when we interact with someone, I think this idea of you did something wrong and you did it because you're a creep or selfish or inconsiderate, right? They go together, and our reactions are just a combined reaction, and that's, I think, the thick account of accountability just puts those together from the beginning, and that's I think, quite a natural human reaction. Epistemically, it's very hard to know, to answer the questions that I think in theory you'd need to answer to get precise about this stuff. But I just think they are different questions, and the fact that you can say of someone who is a sociopath or an inveterate sexist, look, I know he doesn't get it. Still, he knows enough to know I'm not allowed to do that, is enough to hold him accountable.
Yeah, thank you. I feel a bit confused, so you could perhaps help me. Well, yeah, that's a sign of confusion, I guess.
Did I do that?
So one thing is that well, if Strawson is right, if reactive attitudes are interpersonal attitudes, then this would mean that in the case of corporations that are being held accountable, it cannot be a matter of reactive attitudes when we blame and praise corporations. So that would imply that praise and blame actually is not necessarily a reactive attitude, contrary to kind of what you started with, right? But then you said that we could use those terms differently, right? On the other hand, I think that well, when I consider a corporation, right, and I think that, well, corporation is certainly criticizable in your sense. The corporation can appreciate reasons not to be indifferent to human suffering or whatever kind of, yes, and we hold it accountable, but we also think that it's criticizable, right? And we actually can have, I would say, reactive attitudes to this kind of bodies, feel resentment and hatred and admiration, or whatever. So it's a sort of, on the one hand, what you were saying was suggesting that actually Strawson was wrong with this sort of connecting responsibility necessarily to reactive attitudes, because in this case, if corporations are not an appropriate object of interpersonal relationships, then we can only have objective attitudes toward corporations. But on the other hand, I think that it's wrong in another sense, that we can bring in such bodies into interpersonal relationships simply because we think of them as agents having preferences and this kind of having some kind of things that, well, Google can reveal its indifference to human suffering or something like this, right? Yeah.
So I think it's separable to. There are two separable questions here. One is it really true that are corporations criticizable?
Yes.
Can you attribute things to them? Are they criticizable? Can they appreciate reasons not to be indifferent to human suffering?
Yes.
I'm actually a little cagey about this. So there's a case to be made. I think that the answer is no, that you should think of corporations like sociopaths and like right, they can't do that. And though of course individuals who are in the corporations who are making decisions are also, they are capable. And so you might, right, along the case it says no, corporations are not criticizable. You should have objective attitudes towards them, but you can hold them accountable. You could add, by way of trying to make sense of the ease with which we actually do feel reactive attitudes towards, or at least as we would say, Whole Foods or, Exxon or whatever, is because there are individuals making decisions all the time, at least some of them knowing that in deciding this, they're, allowing, they're allowing more pollution or trying to get away from the tobacco industry, lying about. So they're individuals doing things that, and they're criticizable, and it results in the corporations doing it. And so, there's complicated stuff there, right? There's also a case, and to be made for the point of view you have, that it's actually the corporation. At the moment, I don't really understand what you mean when you say they can appreciate the reasons not to be indifferent to human suffering. They can understand that if they're indifferent to human suffering, they'll be liable to damages and maybe out of business. But that's what a sociopath can understand also. I don't think of that as appreciating their reasons. But if there is such a thing, then, yeah, they're criticizable and fine. I mean, I don't have anything at stake other than in arguing for that. That's a whole other complicated position. As to is Strawson wrong about responsibility, I mean, my view at this point is Strawson, like everyone else, including myself, took what I'm now thinking of as the features necessary for criticizability / attributability and the features necessary for accountability as one unified thing, that either you had it or you didn't, or you had it to a degree but didn't. And in that context, he was assuming both those things. When he talked about responsibility and blame, he was talking about beings that most normal adults are, that are both criticizable and accountable. And then, my short history of, post-Strawsonian responsibility theories is that people kept doing that, and yet they kept thinking, they kept focusing on the accountability feature of this package, and on the set of specific reactive attitudes that depend on the accountability feature. But in fact, those features were doing much less of the work in our actual human experiences than we realized.
Ingvar.
Yeah, I think very briefly you mentioned the case of young children, and I guess you thought about children about the age of 3 and 4. But I think that case is even more special than you did it, because if you take the sexist, he knows what accountability in general is. But kids of the age of 3 and 4, they have to learn what accountability is for the very first time in life, and they don't learn it just seeing one case of it. It has to be repeated. And then I have noted in young parents of today, I can divide them briefly into 2 groups. One group's when their beloved kid does something really awful to another kid. They take the kids apart and they tell their own kid, you can't do like this, and explain, because it's a bright kid, he or she has understand language a bit. Some other parents, they say, no, the hell, you can't do like that, and they scream at their own kid. And I took the extremes, that's a continuum, of course. But I happen to think that the screaming way is a better way to learn kids for the first time in life what accountability is, even though in your sense they are not accountable. Definitely not, but nonetheless they have to be blamed. And I've been sitting thinking here, and one label for such a blame would be educating blame. And I think educating blame is needed, and you, perhaps if you have spoken more about young children, you have come to this topic, but you didn't, so I missed it.
Good. Educating blame is a good extra concept. Interestingly, you think it's the screaming kind that's necessary. I'm not sure.
I said there's a continuum.
Right. Yeah. No. Right.
I wanted to make the extremes clear.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do. So on the one hand, I think you're absolutely right, and it's important, though it didn't come into this paper, that accountability is something one has to learn, and development. I mean, one will learn gradually, how to become an accountable agent. But with children, you have to teach these two different things that I think are relevant to the two different aspects of becoming a morally responsible agent in the full and good sense, right? On the one hand, you need to teach them how to be accountable. That is, how to follow rules. Then you need to teach them what the rules are and to develop the capacities for deliberation and control that are necessary in order to follow the rules. But you also have to teach them to see the world in a way that will make them good people, so that the rules are not just, well, I have to follow these rules because I'll get in trouble otherwise, but the rules themselves are interconnected with reasons to care about other people and to, be honest and all this stuff. And that, I don't think, is a matter of accountability, but a matter of a different aspect of education. So I guess I think bringing out both kinds of education would be very useful to sort of fill out this practice.
Thank you. So I have a question that's sort of a follow-up to, it's similar to Vlodek's questions about the corporations, but let me put it a bit differently. So it seems like this ability to avoid sanctions that is needed for accountability, in order for a corporation to be accountable, it seems like it would have to have a ability to deliberate about options and think about reasons for doing various things, so that it's not just about the individuals deliberating, but the corporation itself deliberating. So I was thinking, what do you think would be? I mean, it seems like it would be possible there to bring in various kinds of moral reasons about having to do with avoiding suffering for human beings and so on, in that kind of deliberation. So my question is kind of what do you think would be required in that process, that deliberative process for Google, for example, to be attribute, so that we can attribute a fault to it and criticize it and not just blame it. So would it be sort of sufficient?
And not just hold it accountable.
Yeah. So would it be sufficient that the board sort of brings the issue up and an explicit judgment is made about it, or so it's really like a question about your view, not about the corporation. But I think maybe the corporation can be a sort of good illustration of thinking about what is required to have this kind of sensitivity to various kinds of reasons.
Right. I'm not sure how to answer that question. It's interesting. So there are two different things that are going through my head. I mean, they're two different subjects almost, right? One which has to do with what is it? Does a corporation have reasons to care about human suffering, about avoiding human suffering, or what would it take for a corporation to have such reasons, other than the pragmatic, instrumental reasons that maybe a corporation has to sign on. You're not going to expose your employees to noxious fumes. You're not going to expose your clients to risks of certain kinds of accidents, right? And so you'll be liable. I guess my initial thought here is, well, there are companies, and of course there are nonprofit organizations, other kinds of organizations, that it's part of their mission. It's part of the mission statement. It's right in it's in their, the equivalent of their constitutions, right? Our aim is to, it's not our aim is to avoid human suffering. It's our aim is to reduce, child abuse or to, right? So you might think, look, if it's in there, right, then it's a reason for them, and they're binding themselves to take that into account, and you can, I think, hold them accountable relative to the things that they have accepted as reasons. Stepping away from that and thinking, a corporation, is trying to make as much money within the law as possible. I mean, there are a lot of corporations like that. And to say, do they have a reason to care about human suffering? A non-instrumental reason? To me, that's like crocodiles. I don't really see how what that would mean for a corporation. And for the record, insofar as I'm interested mainly in I keep repeating it, the quote from Strawson, what is it to be a potential member of a participant in interpersonal human relationships, in community? That's what I really care about. I am not going to ever go have a beer with Whole Foods, right? Or the European Union, or that's not, they're not capable of being in an interpersonal community. They're capable of, we're cooperating. We can negotiate with them, but not, So I guess I do feel that's why I'm not really inclined to worry about criticizing them and in the way that I've been talking about. But maybe you can. But the other question, and this was the other line, and maybe you weren't interested. I'm not sure whether you were interested in that question or in this other question, which is, what does it take to have the capacity to appreciate or understand reasons rather than just form the belief with the relevant content? And that, I think, is a really interesting and difficult question. I don't know the answer. If organizations could have it, that would be really fascinating, but, that's a huge question for somebody.
One brief question, there's not much time left.
What if a person finds himself in a complex situation where a lot of causal actions take place? Like
a lot of what actions?
Causal, causality. You know what that is? Am I saying it right?
Cordial?
Causal.
Cultural?
Causal.
Causal. Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Actions are taking place. Like, for instance, Davy Crockett, he found himself in a battle with the American army against the Indians. And there were a lot of women and children killed. And we don't know, but maybe David Crockett participated in some of the killings. Maybe a 13-year-old boy, pre-warrior, came at him with a tomahawk. We don't know. But he certainly blamed himself for being a part of that battle. Afterwards, for a long time, or maybe all his life, actually. So is this critical? Is it to be criticized, or is he to blame?
I don't know. You know? I don't. I think I need more facts.
He died at Alamo,
right.
But the fact is, we don't know the facts.
Right.
We know he participated in this battle, and he could have killed a 13-year-old warrior or something.
Right.
We don't know, but he blamed himself
Right.
for participating in that battle
Right.
for the rest of his life.
Yes. But right. So I can't. I mean, whether he was right to blame himself or whether he was too hard on himself. Those are things. It depends on what the facts were. I mean, I don't.
It's a causality, then. It's if maybe he had to act. Maybe
Right.
there was no time to think. Maybe he could have sneaked away from the battle. We don't know if he could have done that. It's not likely, but he found himself up inside an event of war.
Right.
So he was stuck in it, sort of caught up in the game.
So I think, I mean, this is actually, I think, related to the earlier question about, you know, you run over a child, or I mean, something, you do something terrible that you feel terrible about, and there are many possible stories that that could explain that. You know, one is I was at fault, I was careless, I was inconsiderate, I was callous, I was, you know. In which case you would both blame and criticize yourself, probably. And we, if we knew about it, would maybe also blame and criticize. But it's also possible that it was self-defense, or I could, you know, I couldn't have done anything better. Maybe I'm not accountable. I mean, there's so many possibilities. And as I mentioned very briefly I have this picture. It's a complicated picture, but it looks kind of like, well, at least we know what questions to ask and what if this, you know, if the answer to this question is X, then it follows that you are criticizable. If the answer to this question is Y, then it follows that you're not. It's all, it seems like a clear if complicated picture, but to actually apply it to the world, to apply it to Davy Crockett or to, you know, that's much more difficult. I mean, because you need the details of facts which are often unavailable to any of us, even to the agent. So.
It doesn't answer my question, but
no. It's as good as I got.
So, thank you so much for this lecture, which is impossible to criticize. And we look forward very much to tomorrow's lecture. Although thank you very much for coming.